The world of Pokémon has drifted through our imaginations for nearly 3 decades now, carrying countless small details tucked quietly into its games, shows, and stories. These tiny choices and forgotten mechanics have become more than simple quirks. They've turned into gentle reminders of the care and creativity that shaped the universe many of us grew up with. But within these quiet corners, a few details stand even further out of reach, resting in places where early development experiments and overlooked design moments blur into soft mysteries whispered by longtime fans. And the best place to begin is where one of those small, forgotten fragments still sits quietly behind the earliest sprites ever created. Before computers handled every intricate detail of creature design, artists at Game Freak sat at desks with graph paper spread before them, sketching each individual pixel square by square in a process that felt more like crafting mosaics than digital art. The proportions that emerged from this manual labor were often exaggerated in ways that still define how we remember those early creatures, with heads growing unusually large to remain readable on the tiny Game Boy screen and limbs shrinking to accommodate the limited resolution. The final evolution of the first fire starter became iconic, partly because of these technical constraints. Its bulky silhouette and small arms, not born from artistic whimsy, but from the practical need to create shapes that players could recognize at a glance. This hand-drawn origin gives those early designs a charm that persists decades later, a warmth that reminds us of the human hands that carefully shaded each square before entering them into the system, and it leaves a quiet impression once you notice it. And before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. The original soundtrack faced equally remarkable limitations that shaped the soundscape of our earliest adventures through Kanto. The Game Boy hardware allowed only 4 sound channels to play simultaneously, which meant that every piece of music had to carefully balance melody, harmony, bass, and rhythm within this narrow technical window. Junichi Masuda, who composed most of the original score, discovered creative techniques to simulate more instruments than the system should have supported, using quick arpeggios to create the illusion of full chords where only single notes could technically play. Pitch shifts and careful timing allowed him to mimic drum hits and percussion without dedicating an entire channel to rhythm alone, proving that imagination could transcend the boundaries of primitive technology. These musical innovations made the world feel far richer than its technical specifications suggested it should, transforming simple beeps into memorable melodies that would echo through our minds for years after we closed the Game Boy. The battle themes pulsed with energy that made our hearts race even though they were constructed from the most basic of electronic sounds, while the gentle music of towns like Pallet and Viridian wrapped us in warmth and safety. When we wandered through tall grass listening to the root themes, we were experiencing the triumph of creativity over hardware barriers. A testament to how much developers cared about crafting an atmosphere that would stay with us long after the cartridge was removed. The soundtrack became so beloved that orchestral arrangements would be performed decades later, proof that those 4-channel limitations had actually birthed something timeless. A hidden piece of trivia about the first games lies in the way critical hits were calculated, a mechanic that most players never fully understood, even as they experienced its effects in every battle. Instead of each move having a fixed percentage chance to land a critical hit, the likelihood was directly tied to the attacking creature's speed stat, meaning faster beings had dramatically higher odds of delivering devastating blows. The sleek cat from Kanto, with its exceptional swiftness, could score critical hits with startling frequency, while slower and bulkier defenders rarely experienced the satisfaction of that damage multiplier. This made speed disproportionately valuable in the early competitive landscape, turning swift strikers into dangerous threats that could topple even the sturdiest opponents through sheer unpredictability. The mechanic was eventually revised in future generations to create more balanced gameplay, but those who experienced the wild swings of early battles remember the tension that came with not knowing when a critical hit might change everything. It taught players to respect speed as a stat, to build teams that could either leverage quickness or survive against it, and to accept that sometimes battles would be decided by factors beyond their direct control. The randomness added drama to playground confrontations and late night link cable matches, creating stories that would be retold with excitement and frustration in equal measure, and it lingers softly in the background of the series, shaping how we think about battle strategy even now. Localization hides fascinating cultural details that were transformed as the franchise crossed from Japan to international audiences, carrying with it references that needed careful adaptation. The item known abroad as a rare candy originally used a phrase in Japanese that more closely translates to mysterious sweet, reflecting cultural fascination with treats that appear in folklore and fairy tales. Similarly, the move splash, forever associated with a certain flopping fish that does nothing in battle, was actually a mistranslation of a word meaning hop or jump, which explains why grass creatures like Hoppip can learn it despite having no connection to water. These translation quirks became permanent fixtures of the series, odd naming choices that fans grew to love precisely because they added character and mystery to the experience. The process of giving every creature an English name was a massive undertaking that required legal teams to trademark hundreds of words across multiple countries, ensuring that each name would be unique and protectable. The localization team wanted names that would resonate with English-speaking children while maintaining some connection to the creature's characteristics or Japanese origins, a balancing act that sometimes produced brilliant results and other times led to puzzling choices. Pikachu kept its Japanese name because it was already distinctive and easy to pronounce, a decision that helped the mascot maintain global consistency. Others underwent more dramatic transformations, like the fighting types that were renamed after martial arts legends, Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan, making their nature immediately clear to Western audiences while maintaining the same conceptual approach as their Japanese counterparts. The anime brought its own layer of unique facts to the growing franchise, creating a parallel world that both reflected and diverged from the games. Early on, many creature cries were voiced not by digital effects, but by human actors who imitated animal sounds with remarkable skill and emotional nuance. Pikachu's iconic voice was performed by Ikue Otani, whose gentle inflections gave the mascot warmth and personality that a simple electronic beep could never convey, transforming a game character into a beloved companion that felt genuinely alive. Other creatures like Bulbasaur were also voiced by actors who blended growls and calls into recognizable patterns of speech, giving each being a distinct personality that helped the anime stand apart from the games. This choice to use human voices rather than recycling the game's electronic cries helped cement the anime as its own unique interpretation of the world, one where creatures felt more like characters with thoughts and emotions rather than battling tools. The decision created memorable moments, like Pikachu's refusal to evolve, or Meowth's ability to speak human language, that would have been impossible without the expressive range that voice acting provided. Children watching the show felt a deeper connection to these beings because they could hear emotion in their cries, pain and joy, and fire and triumph, all conveyed through vocal performances that transcended language barriers. The anime's influence grew so strong that Pikachu's cry in later games was changed to match the voice from the show, a rare instance of the anime reshaping the games rather than the other way around. Trading has always been central to the series, but one little known fact is that developers originally considered making trades carry risks, introducing an element of uncertainty to the process. Early design notes suggested a small chance that a trade might fail, symbolizing the difficulty and danger of transporting living creatures through digital cables stretched between Game Boys. This idea was quickly abandoned for being too harsh and potentially frustrating, but the short animation that plays during trades remains one of the most nostalgic memories for fans of the link cable era. Watching creatures transform into data and travel through the cable felt magical, as though technology itself had become a bridge between worlds, connecting two separate adventures into a shared experience. The physical act of connecting two Game Boys with the cable added a social dimension that modern wireless trading cannot quite replicate, requiring players to sit close together and coordinate their actions. The soft clicking sound of the cable being inserted, the loading screen with its mysterious patterns, and the final confirmation that the trade was complete all contributed to a ritual that made exchanging creatures feel momentous and special. Friends would gather to help each other evolve trade-dependent species, creating memories tied not just to the games, but to the friendships that made those trades possible. The link cable era taught a generation about cooperation and trust, about the value of helping others even when there was no immediate benefit, and about the joy that comes from seeing someone else's face light up when they receive exactly what they needed. The theme of fossils introduced another fascinating layer to the world, inspired by Japan's deep cultural interest in paleontology and ancient history. Developers wanted to convey that the world had existed long before the present adventure, that the regions we explored had histories stretching back millions of years, filled with creatures and ecosystems that had risen and fallen long before any trainer walked these routes. Reviving extinct beings from ancient stones gave players the feeling that they were participating in something profound, bringing back life that had been lost to time, and giving these prehistoric creatures a second chance in the modern era. This mechanic hinted at depths beneath the surface of the adventure, suggesting that every cave and mountain might hold secrets from ages past. Children realized that their tiny handheld game represented an ecosystem with its own evolutionary history, its own legends and ruins, its own ancient mysteries waiting to be uncovered by those patient enough to explore every corner. The fossil mechanic taught subtle lessons about extinction and preservation, about how species can vanish from the world but leave traces behind, and about humanity's power to resurrect what was thought lost forever. Later generations would expand on this theme with regional variants and time-traveling paradoxes, but the simple act of choosing between two fossils in the earliest games planted the seed for all those future explorations of time and change, and it settles quietly in the atmosphere of the early games, reminding us that depth was always part of the design. As we drift a little deeper tonight into the hidden mechanics that shaped our experiences, we find that encounter rates themselves carried secrets most players never consciously noticed. The earliest games stored encounter information not just by area or route, but by specific patches of grass, with some individual tiles carrying slightly higher odds of triggering wild battles. The difference was so minimal that statistical analysis would be needed to confirm it, yet playground rumors grew about lucky spots where rare creatures could supposedly be found with greater frequency. While the mathematical advantage was modest at best, the effect was real enough to inspire myths that lasted for years, blending actual code with childhood imagination into shared folklore that connected players across the world. These whispered secrets about which patch of grass to stand in, or which direction to face, or how many steps to take before encountering something special, all contributed to the sense that the games held mysteries beyond what the official guides revealed. The truth was usually simpler than the rumors suggested, but the willingness of players to believe in hidden patterns and secret knowledge showed how deeply we wanted the world to contain more than met the eye. Developers likely never intended for encounter rates to become the subject of such elaborate theories, yet the community's response demonstrated that even tiny variations in probability could spark wonder and speculation. This interplay between programmed reality and player interpretation became a defining characteristic of the franchise, where official mechanics and fan theories existed side by side, neither entirely true nor entirely false. Another overlooked quirk lies in how prize money was handled after battles, a system that carried deeper meaning than simple punishment for defeat. When players lost a battle, a portion of their money was deducted, simulating the reality of traveling with limited resources and teaching children that preparations and caution mattered in a world where danger lurked in every patch of grass. The mechanic encouraged players to heal before challenging strong trainers, to stock up on items before entering caves, and to retreat to safety when their team was weakened rather than pushing forward recklessly. Later in the Johto games, this system expanded to include the mother character saving money on the player's behalf, occasionally buying items that would appear in the PC, adding warmth to the adventure by making family feel like an active part of the journey rather than a forgotten detail left behind in the starting town. The mother's role, though small, added emotional depth to the experience, reminding players that they had someone waiting at home who cared about their well-being and wanted to support their dreams. Receiving a gift from home after hours of exploration created a sense of connection across the digital distance, a reminder that the adventure was not entirely solitary. The money-saving feature also taught practical lessons about managing resources and accepting help from others, about the value of having a safety net when taking risks. These seemingly minor details contributed to the games feeling like coherent worlds, rather than just collections of battles and puzzles, worlds where trainers had lives beyond what we directly controlled, where families existed and communities functioned according to their own quiet rhythms. Shiny creatures, first introduced in the Johto generation, opened another realm of fascination that would define collecting culture for decades to come. The red Gyarados, placed deliberately at the Lake of Rage, was a design choice meant to ensure that every child experienced the thrill of encountering a differently colored being, sparking curiosity and inspiring playground conversations about these mysterious variants. Developers wanted to create a sense of wonder around the feature, to make shinies feel like legends that could be real rather than impossible dreams, and the guaranteed encounter achieved exactly that by showing players what they should be looking for in the wild. While the odds of randomly finding a shiny were astronomically low, 1 in 8,192 encounters, the deliberate placement of that red Gyarados turned the feature into one of the most memorable events in franchise history. The sparkle animation that accompanied shiny encounters became burned into our memories, a visual signal that something rare and special was happening, that luck had aligned in our favor for just a moment. Players developed elaborate hunting strategies, learned about chain fishing and Masuda method breeding, spent hundreds of hours pursuing specific targets with patience that bordered on obsession, all because the thrill of seeing that sparkle was worth every failed attempt. The shiny hunting community grew into its own subculture within the larger fandom, with players sharing stories of their luckiest finds and their longest dry spells, celebrating successes together and commiserating over defeats, united by the understanding that shiny hunting was fundamentally about the journey rather than the destination. The cultural impact of the franchise's first movie deserves its own quiet reflection, as it marked a turning point in how the world perceived what had begun as a simple game for children. When Mewtwo Strikes Back premiered in Japan, schools reported lower attendance as children skipped classes to see the film on opening day, drawn by the promise of exclusive trading cards and the chance to experience their favorite creatures on the big screen. The movie paired merchandising with storytelling in ways that drove both the film and the card game into simultaneous cultural phenomena, creating a feedback loop where each medium strengthened the other's appeal. Themes of cloning, identity, and morality surprised audiences who expected simple entertainment, proving that the franchise could carry emotional weight alongside its playful adventure. And for many, the sight of Mew and Mewtwo clashing remains one of the defining memories of their childhood. The film's emotional climax, where all creatures are turned to stone and tears bring them back to life, affected an entire generation in ways that cartoons rarely achieved, teaching lessons about the value of life and the futility of violence through a story that respected its young audience enough to tackle difficult questions. The English dub made changes that softened some of the darker themes, but even in its altered form, the movie resonated deeply with viewers who were not accustomed to seeing their entertainment take such serious subjects seriously. The scene where Pikachu tries desperately to wake its petrified trainer became iconic, a wordless expression of grief and loyalty that transcended cultural and linguistic barriers. Decades later, adults who saw the movie as children still remember how it made them feel, still tear up thinking about that moment, proof that the franchise's reach extended far beyond simple nostalgia. Game mechanics also held surprises that shaped competitive strategies in unexpected ways, like how self-destruct and explosion functioned in the earliest generations. These moves halved the target's defense during damage calculation, which effectively made them hit much harder than their already impressive base power suggested, turning glass cannon creatures like Electrode into dangerous threats that could take down even the bulkiest defenders. The trade-off was severe, as the user would faint immediately after attacking, but the sheer destructive power left a lasting impression on anyone who witnessed or experienced it. The strategy of using one final explosion became legendary on playgrounds and in competitive battles, a dramatic last resort that could turn the tide of a match if timed correctly. Players learned to respect these moves, to predict when an opponent might be desperate enough to use them, to position their teams so that losing one creature to an explosion would not cost them the entire battle. The mechanic encouraged aggressive play and risk-taking, rewarding players who were willing to sacrifice pieces of their team for strategic advantage. Later generations would nerf the moves by removing the defense-halving effect, making them less dominant but still powerful, a change that showed how developers were willing to rebalance mechanics when they became too centralizing. For those who battled in the early days, though, the memory of watching Electrode light up before the screen went white remains vivid, a reminder of when battles felt wilder and more unpredictable. The naming of regions reveals another layer of care in how the world was constructed, each area grounded in real geography while maintaining its fantasy elements. Kanto was based loosely on Tokyo and its surrounding prefectures, with cities positioned to roughly match actual locations, turning the game into a miniature tour of Japan's capital region for those aware of the connection. Johto drew from cultural themes of towers and tradition, evoking the ancient capitals of Kyoto and Nara with their temples and historical significance. Hoenn took inspiration from the island of Kyushu with its mix of volcanic land and surrounding ocean, creating a region defined by the interaction between fire and water, between explosive natural forces and the calming influence of the sea. By grounding each map in real geography, developers made these fantasy worlds feel strangely familiar, landscapes that echoed actual places even as they diverged into imagination and myth. Children might not have consciously realized the connections, but the regions felt authentic in ways that purely invented locations often do not, carrying the weight of real topography and climate and culture. This approach taught players about the world beyond their screens without making it feel like an educational exercise, introducing them to the diversity of landscapes and ecosystems that exist across different regions. The cities named after colors in Kanto, the towns named after plants in Johto, the cities named after combinations of nature and elements in Hoenn. All these naming schemes created subtle patterns that made the world feel intentionally designed rather than randomly assembled. Even small details like bicycles carry layers of trivia worth exploring as we continue our gentle drift through these facts. In the earliest games, running shoes did not exist, so faster travel depended entirely on obtaining the bicycle, which became a milestone reward that marked a significant point in the journey. Developers worried that children might skip dialogue or story beats if they could simply run everywhere from the beginning, so the bicycle was locked behind progression to ensure that players experienced the world at a measured pace before gaining the freedom of speed. This design choice reflected a careful balance between player freedom and narrative pacing, teaching patience before offering convenience, and it worked because receiving the bicycle felt like earning a privilege rather than being given a tool. Later games introduced running shoes as an intermediate speed option, but the bike retained its symbolic status as a tool of joyful exploration, something players actively chose to use rather than something required for basic travel. The bicycle theme music became one of the most recognizable tracks in the series, upbeat and energetic, perfectly capturing the feeling of racing down routes with wind metaphorically rushing past. The transition from walking to biking changed how players interacted with routes and towns, making previously tedious journeys feel quick and efficient, opening up the world in ways that walking never could. This seemingly simple addition of faster movement actually transformed the gameplay experience, demonstrating how quality of life features can fundamentally alter how a game feels to play. The trading card game played an unexpected role in shaping the video games themselves, serving as a testing ground for move interactions and balance adjustments. Designers often used the TCG to experiment with new mechanics on paper before programming them into the games, as it was far easier and faster to print test cards than to code and debug new systems. This cross-pollination between the card game and the video games explains why certain moves and abilities appeared in the TCG first before being added to the main series, creating a bidirectional flow of ideas that enriched both formats. The success of the card game also funded further development of the video games, creating a virtuous cycle where each success enabled the other to grow and improve. The card game introduced players to strategic thinking in different ways than the video games did, as managing a deck required different skills than building a battle team, and many competitive players found that excelling at one format helped them understand the other more deeply. The physical aspect of collecting cards added another dimension to the experience, turning pursuit of rare cards into its own hobby separate from, but connected to the games. Playground trading sessions became as important as link cable battles, with children negotiating deals and learning the social skills of bargaining and compromise. The holographic shine of rare cards created visual excitement that screen-based games could not match, while the games offered interactive experiences that cards could only represent statically. Together, They formed a multimedia empire that reinforced itself at every point, each element making the others more appealing. One of the strangest and most persistent rumors in the early days surrounded the truck near the SS Anne in Kanto, an innocuous piece of scenery that became the subject of endless theories. Children believed that Mew was hidden beneath it, spawning playground debates about how to access the mythical creature that everyone wanted but almost no one had. The truck existed in the game's data, but was positioned in a location players could not normally reach, visible only through glitches or by performing specific sequence breaks, and this inaccessibility made it seem intentionally placed to hide something valuable. While the truck was ultimately just scenery, with no special properties or hidden encounters, the myth persisted long enough to become one of gaming's most famous urban legends. Decades later, developers acknowledged the rumor with nods in remakes and interviews, proving how powerful community-driven storytelling could be, how player imagination could create meaning where none was originally intended. The Mew under the truck legend represented something deeper than just a mistaken belief. It symbolized the hope that the games contained more secrets than we had discovered, that persistence and creativity might uncover wonders that official sources denied existed. This hope drove players to explore every corner of every map, to talk to every character multiple times, to try impossible combinations of actions just in case something magical might happen. The fact that the truck eventually rewarded nothing did not diminish the value of the search, because the journey created its own stories and its own sense of community among those who pursued the same impossible dream. Before we drift any further, maybe tap subscribe for more calming videos, and tell me where you're joining from tonight. Even the music of towns carried layers of meaning that shaped how we felt about different locations, none more famous than Lavender Town with its unsettling melody. The unusual musical scale used for its composition gave it a haunting tone unlike any other track in the game, a deliberate choice to make the town associated with death and ghost types feel eerie and uncomfortable. While myths about hidden messages or dangerous frequencies that supposedly affected children's health were pure fabrications, the fact remains that the town's music shaped emotional memories for an entire generation, becoming synonymous with unease and mystery. It showed how powerful sound design could be in creating atmosphere, how a simple melody could evoke feelings that visual elements alone could not. The cemetery in Lavender Town, the ghost encounters in the tower, and the somber music all combined to create a place that felt different from the rest of the colorful adventure, a reminder that the world contains sadness and loss alongside joy and discovery. Many players remember feeling genuinely unsettled when first entering the town, a testament to how effectively the designers communicated tone through limited hardware. The fact that resolving the town's ghost story required empathy and understanding rather than violence added emotional depth to the experience, teaching that some problems could not be solved through battle. The Pokémon Tower became a place of mourning and remembrance, where trainers came to honor fallen companions, and the game respected this purpose by making it feel sacred and solemn. Slowly, the story widens as we move from individual mechanics to broader design philosophies that shaped entire generations. The decision to include breeding in the second generation fundamentally changed how players interacted with their creatures, introducing concepts of genetics and inheritance that added new dimensions to collecting and battling. Suddenly, moves could be passed from parents to offspring, creating possibilities for combinations that were otherwise impossible. The Masuda method, named after the director who implemented it, gave players a way to slightly increase shiny odds by breeding creatures from different language games, acknowledging the international nature of the fan base and rewarding those who connected with players from other countries. Breeding transformed how competitive players built their teams, as obtaining perfect specimens now required not just luck in catching, but patience in hatching and rejecting imperfect offspring until the desired combination emerged. The daycare system, where creatures could be left to produce eggs, became a central feature that players returned to repeatedly throughout their adventures. The surprise of discovering which moves an egg might know, which hidden ability it might possess, which stats might be perfect, added excitement to the process of hatching each new generation. This system also introduced moral questions that the games never explicitly addressed about what happened to the countless imperfect creatures that were hatched and then released or stored permanently in boxes, creatures that existed but would never be used. The concept of held items added another layer of strategy and customization, allowing creatures to carry berries, type boosting items, status healing resources, or battle enhancing tools that opened up countless new strategic possibilities. The addition of held items meant that two identical creatures could function completely differently in battle depending on what they carried, multiplying the viable strategies and team compositions exponentially. Berries, in particular, added depth by introducing resource management and timing considerations, as players had to decide whether to use berries immediately for tactical advantage or save them for critical moments later in a match. The games never fully tutorialized how powerful held items could be, leaving players to discover their potential through experimentation and competitive play. The physical and special split that occurred later in the franchise's timeline might seem like a minor technical adjustment, but it fundamentally reshaped how creatures were evaluated and used in battle. Before the split, whether a move dealt physical or special damage was determined entirely by its type rather than the move itself, meaning that all fire moves were special and all fighting moves were physical regardless of what made logical sense. This created strange situations where creatures with high attack stats but physical-based typing were locked into using special moves that did not benefit from their natural strengths, while others with high special attack were forced to use physical moves that wasted their potential. When the split happened, each move was individually designated as physical or special based on what made sense for that specific attack, suddenly making dozens of creatures viable that had previously been handicapped by the type-based system. Players who had written off certain species as weak discovered that they could now fulfill their intended roles properly, using the stats they were designed around rather than being forced into unsuitable playstyles. The split required careful rebalancing of move pools and base stats across the entire roster, a massive undertaking that showed how committed developers were to improving the competitive depth of the series. This change demonstrated that even long-established mechanics could be reconsidered and improved when they no longer served the game's best interests, a willingness to evolve that has kept the franchise fresh across multiple decades. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, technical improvements that most players never thought about consciously, but that dramatically improved their experience in subtle ways. The ability to run indoors, introduced after several generations of being forced to walk in buildings, seemed like a tiny quality of life enhancement, but made navigation feel significantly smoother and more natural. The shift to always being able to access the PC from anywhere rather than needing to find a Pokémon Center added convenience, while slightly reducing the sense of being on a genuine journey where resources and access to services were limited. The removal of HM moves as requirements for exploration freed up move slots and eliminated the need for HM slave creatures, though some players missed the intentionality that came from needing to plan teams around utility moves. Each generation made small adjustments that collectively reshaped how the games felt to play, smoothing rough edges while sometimes losing textures that had made the early games feel more like survival adventures than power fantasies. The addition of experience share items that could be turned on or off allowed players to choose their own difficulty curve, making it easier to keep full teams leveled evenly, but also making it harder to maintain challenge for experienced players who wanted to be tested. These changes reflected evolving design philosophies about what constituted fun, about whether convenience should be prioritized over simulation elements, about whether games should respect player time or demand patience and repetition as part of the intended experience. The introduction of abilities in the third generation added yet another layer of complexity that would become fundamental to how creatures were differentiated and strategized around. Abilities provided passive effects that triggered automatically, from simple bonuses like boosting a stat in certain weather conditions to game-changing effects that could completely alter how a creature needed to be handled in battle. The ability system meant that even creatures with similar stats and types could play completely differently based on their passive effects, dramatically increasing roster diversity and strategic depth. Hidden abilities, introduced later, added another collecting goal and made hunting for perfect specimens even more involved. The ability system also created interesting design space for signature abilities that made certain creatures feel truly unique, like legendary beings with abilities that activated immediately upon entering battle, or common creatures with niche abilities that allowed them to fill specific roles in competitive play. The interaction between abilities and held items and move sets created a combinatorial explosion of viable strategies, making it nearly impossible for any single player to have mastered every possible team composition. This depth kept competitive play fresh across years of the same generation, as new strategies were constantly being discovered and old assumptions were challenged by creative team building. Weather mechanics expanded from simple background elements to strategic considerations with mechanical effects, transformed how battles were approached at the competitive level. Rain boosted water moves and enabled certain abilities. Harsh sunlight empowered fire moves and activated others. Sandstorms and hail created passive damage and triggered specific abilities, all combining to create an additional strategic layer that teams needed to account for. Weather wars became a defining feature of competitive play, with teams built specifically to establish and maintain favorable conditions while disrupting opponents' weather strategies. The weather mechanic demonstrated how a relatively simple system could create emergent complexity, as the interaction between weather effects and the dozens of abilities and moves that referenced them produced countless strategic possibilities. The shift to three-dimensional graphics in later generations changed not just how the games looked, but how they felt to play, replacing the overhead perspective with more cinematic camera angles and dynamic battle animations. Creatures that had existed as static sprites or simple models suddenly displayed personality through idle animations, battle movements, and reactions to being hit or delivering attacks. The transition to full 3D was not without controversy, as some beloved creatures translated awkwardly to the new format, while others gained new life through expressive animations. The technical demands of 3D also meant that certain features had to be scaled back or removed, leading to discussions about whether graphical fidelity should be prioritized over content depth. The 3D transition allowed for more dramatic set pieces and cinematic moments, with legendary encounters becoming elaborate spectacles rather than simple battle screens, and regions designed to showcase vistas and landmarks that would have been impossible to properly convey in 2D. The sense of scale changed as players could see distant mountains or cities from routes, making the world feel more connected and cohesive. The trade off was that routes became more linear in many cases, as 3D environments were more expensive to design and test than 2D maps, leading to a reduction in the maze like complexity that had characterized earlier routes. These changes sparked debates within the fan base about whether newer games had lost some of the exploration focused design that had made the early entries special. As we drift a little deeper tonight, consider how the concept of regional variance breathed new life into familiar creatures by reimagining them through different environmental lenses. The idea that the same species might adapt differently when isolated in different climates and ecosystems allowed developers to revisit beloved designs with fresh takes, giving creatures new types, abilities, and aesthetics while maintaining recognizable elements from their original forms. Regional variants became a way to honor the past while creating something new, satisfying nostalgia while pushing the designs in unexpected directions. The variants also provided in-world justification for updating creatures whose original designs or stat distributions had aged poorly, allowing them to be rebalanced and reimagined without simply replacing the originals. The concept of divergent evolution implied by regional variants added depth to the world building, suggesting that the regions we explored were genuinely separate ecosystems with their own evolutionary pressures and histories. It raised interesting questions about how and why certain creatures had spread to multiple regions, while others remained endemic to specific areas, about what controlled migration patterns and adaptation rates, about whether human intervention might have introduced species to new environments where they then adapted. These questions were rarely answered directly, but the implication was that the world had natural processes occurring beyond what players directly observed, creating a sense that the adventure took place within a living, functioning ecosystem rather than a static backdrop. The inclusion of ancient and future forms in later games pushed the variant concept even further, introducing paradox creatures that challenged our understanding of how time and evolution functioned in this world. These designs provoked discussion about whether they represented actual past and future states, or were perhaps creatures from alternate timelines, dimensional variants rather than temporal ones. The ambiguity was intentional, creating mystery and speculation while allowing multiple interpretations to coexist. The paradox creatures demonstrated how far the franchise had come in sophistication, from simple monster collecting to a world with complex temporal mechanics and multiverse implications, yet still maintaining the core appeal of discovering and collecting unique creatures. The bond between trainer and creature, a theme present from the beginning, but explored with increasing depth in later games, became a central pillar of the narrative in ways that earlier entries only hinted at. The concept of friendship affecting evolution, first introduced with creatures like Golbat evolving into Crobat, added a mechanical representation of emotional bonds that rewarded players for caring about their teams beyond simple stat optimization. The friendship mechanic was intentionally opaque, requiring players to intuit how different actions affected their creature's happiness, creating a system that felt more like genuine relationship building than the number management. Later games would make friendship more visible and easier to manipulate, a change that made the system more accessible, but perhaps less emotionally resonant. The Mega Evolution mechanic took the bond theme even further, requiring both a strong friendship and special items to temporarily transform creatures into more powerful forms during battle. The visual spectacle of Mega Evolution, with its dramatic animations and redesigned appearances, made these transformations feel momentous and special, temporary bursts of power that represented perfect synchronization between trainer and creature. The mechanic was eventually phased out in favor of other gimmicks, but for the generations where it existed, Mega Evolution provided the memorable moments of turning the tide of difficult battles through the power of bonds forged across long journeys. The Z move system that followed represented a different approach to the same theme, giving all creatures access to once per battle devastating attacks that required specific poses and a bond between trainer and creature to unleash. The elaborate dance animations for Z moves were simultaneously silly and sincere, embodying a kind of earnest enthusiasm that defined the franchise's willingness to commit fully to its concepts, regardless of how absurd they might seem from outside. The democracy of Z moves, available to any creature rather than select few, meant that even unusual favorites could have their moment of glory with a perfectly timed super attack. This accessibility reflected a philosophy shift toward letting players use their favorites rather than feeling pressured to use only the statistically optimal choices. Dynamaxing and Gigantamax forms continued this evolution of battle gimmicks, this time focusing on sheer size and spectacle, transforming creatures into towering giants that dominated the battlefield for a few turns before returning to normal. The Gigantamax variants of certain species provided yet another form of customization and collecting goals, special appearances that could only be accessed by creatures obtained from specific encounters or events. Each of these battle gimmicks divided fans between those who embraced the new strategic possibilities and those who preferred the simpler battle systems of earlier generations, but all of them attempted to make individual battles feel more dramatic and consequential through limited use power boosts tied to narrative themes of bonds and potential. The post-game content in various entries has provided some of the most challenging and rewarding experiences the franchise offers, creating spaces where mechanics and strategy could be pushed to their limits. Battle facilities with specialized rules and opponents using competitive strategies gave players reasons to continue playing long after completing the main story, to experiment with team compositions and strategies that the relatively easy main game never required. The difficulty spike between the main campaign and serious post-game content could be jarring, revealing just how much the games had been holding back during the story portion, but this created a satisfying progression where mastery of advanced mechanics was rewarded. The Frontier facilities, in particular, became beloved by competitive players for their variety and creativity, presenting different rules and challenges that required completely different team-building approaches. The streaks required to earn rare items and rare creatures meant that consistent success demanded not just good strategy, but also luck and perseverance, creating achievement goals that took dozens of hours to complete. The satisfaction of finally earning that elusive symbol or trophy after numerous failed attempts created memories that stuck with players as strongly as any story moment, proof that mechanical challenge could be as emotionally resonant as narrative when executed well. The competitive scene that grew around the games demonstrated how deep the strategic possibilities ran beneath the child-friendly exterior, with professional players discovering strategies and synergies that developers had never anticipated. The emergence of tier systems, of complex calculations for optimal move sets and stat distributions, of prediction and mind games at the highest level of play, showed that the simple rock-paper-scissors type chart was merely the foundation for a genuinely sophisticated strategic game. The competitive community developed its own culture, its own terminology, its own celebrities, largely independent from the casual player base, yet still fundamentally engaged with the same core systems. The existence of both casual and competitive scenes, often with minimal overlap, demonstrated the franchise's remarkable ability to serve multiple audiences simultaneously, to be both a relaxing collecting game and a demanding competitive challenge, depending on how players chose to engage with it. This flexibility meant that players could shift between different modes of engagement as their interests evolved, that the same game could serve someone throughout childhood as a simple adventure, and then throughout adulthood as a complex strategy game. The longevity of individual entries, with communities still actively playing and competing in games released decades ago, testified to the depth and replayability built into the core design. There's a quiet comfort in remembering how the franchise has adapted and evolved while maintaining its essential identity, how innovations have been layered onto the foundation without completely replacing what came before. The core loop of exploring routes, catching creatures, battling trainers, and collecting badges has remained remarkably consistent even as the presentation and mechanical complexity have grown exponentially. This consistency provides a sense of familiarity that makes returning to the series feel like coming home, even when individual entries introduce significant changes to formulas or mechanics. New players can still grasp the basic concepts quickly, while experienced players can appreciate the added depth that years of iteration have provided. The storytelling has grown more ambitious over time, moving from simple journeys to become champion toward narratives involving world-ending threats, parallel dimensions, and complex moral questions about the relationship between humans and creatures. Some fans prefer the simpler narratives that allowed players to project their own stories onto the adventure, while others appreciate the increased characterization and plot complexity of modern entries. Both approaches have merit, and the franchise has experimented with different narrative tones across generations, sometimes prioritizing player freedom and sometimes pushing toward more directed cinematic experiences. The best entries find balance between these approaches, providing enough story to create emotional investment while leaving room for players to create their own headcanon and personal narratives. The music has remained consistently excellent across every generation, with each entry producing memorable themes that become inextricably linked to the regions they represent. Battle themes still quicken pulses, town themes still provide comfort and nostalgia, legendary encounter themes still evoke awe and tension, all through melodies that have evolved in complexity while maintaining the recognizable style that defines the franchise's sound. The decision to keep music prominent rather than minimalist means that soundtracks are often the first thing that triggers memory when players think back on past entries, melodies surfacing unbidden years after the last time they played. The care put into musical composition demonstrates understanding that audio contributes as much to atmosphere and emotional impact as visuals or gameplay. The creature designs themselves have sparked endless discussions about philosophy and aesthetics, about whether newer entries maintain the quality of early generations or represent decline, about whether simpler designs are inherently better than complex ones. The truth is that every generation contains both simple and complex designs, both beloved and divisive choices, both instant classics and creatures that most players forget exist. The sheer number of creatures means that individual preferences vary wildly, with nearly everyone having both favorites and least favorites across the entire roster. This diversity of designs ensures that virtually every player can find creatures that resonate with them personally, that match their aesthetic preferences or strategic inclinations. The decision to continue adding new creatures with each generation rather than simply recycling the existing roster keeps the series feeling fresh and surprising, though it also creates challenges as the total number approaches 4 digits and tracking them all becomes increasingly difficult. The regional Pokédex approach, limiting which creatures are available in each game, helps manage this overwhelming scope by focusing each entry on a curated selection rather than attempting to include everything. This approach frustrates completionists, but allows developers to ensure that the available creatures fit the region's theme and environmental variety, creating rosters that feel cohesive rather than arbitrary. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. The transfer systems that allow creatures to move forward from older games into newer ones represent a commitment to honoring the time players have invested in building their collections and teams. The effort required to maintain backwards compatibility through hardware and software changes demonstrates respect for the bond players form with their digital companions, treating them as genuinely valuable rather than disposable game assets. The limitations that sometimes prevent certain creatures from being transferred forward due to mechanical incompatibilities or deliberate roster restrictions create genuine disappointment for players who find their favorites excluded from new entries, highlighting how much these digital entities can matter emotionally. The decision to eventually patch transfer compatibility into games that launched without it shows developers listening to feedback and understanding the importance of collection continuity to long-term fans. The cloud storage systems that emerged in later generations, allowing creatures to exist in centralized servers rather than being locked to individual cartridges, modernized the approach while introducing new anxieties about server shutdowns and long-term preservation. The tension between convenience and security, between accessibility and ownership, reflects broader questions about digital content and online services that extend far beyond this franchise. The event distribution system, using limited time promotional giveaways to distribute rare creatures and items, has been both a clever marketing tool and a source of frustration for players who miss events or live in regions without access. The exclusivity creates artificial scarcity that makes obtaining these creatures feel special, but it also locks content behind time-limited windows in ways that feel arbitrary and punishing to players who discover the series after events have ended. The shift toward more accessible distribution methods and longer event windows in recent years suggests acknowledgement that permanent missability creates more negative feelings than positive ones for most players, though some still appreciate the rarity and exclusive status that comes from owning event creatures. The mythology and lore embedded in legendary creatures and their associated stories add depth to regions that transcends simple gameplay mechanics, creating narrative reasons to explore and engage with the world. The creation myths involving creatures that shaped continents or generated the universe itself give the world a sense of ancient history and cosmic significance, elevating the setting beyond simple adventure backdrop into something that feels genuinely mythological. The vagueness of much of this lore, communicated through fragmentary hints and optional texts rather than explicit exposition, allows players to piece together their own understanding of how the world functions and what these powerful beings represent. The environmental messages embedded in various entries about the importance of respecting nature and maintaining balance between progress and preservation resonate differently depending on player age and cultural context. Some appreciate the earnest advocacy for environmental consciousness, while others find it heavy-handed, but the consistency with which these themes appear suggests they are important to the creators rather than mere window dressing. The pollution-type creatures, the storylines about corporate exploitation of nature, the emphasis on creatures as living beings deserving of respect, all contribute to a worldview that positions nature and technology not as inherently opposed, but as requiring careful balance. The day and night cycle, first introduced in Johto, added temporal rhythm to the adventure that made the world feel more alive and dynamic. Certain creatures appearing only at specific times of day encouraged players to think about when they played and to plan their activities around the clock, adding another layer of consideration to exploration and collecting. The visual changes between day and night, though simple, contributed to atmosphere and sense of place in ways that static time never could. The cycle also enabled time based events and evolutions that added novelty to progression systems, making certain creatures feel more special because obtaining them required specific timing rather than just luck or level grinding. The weekly event system, built around the day night cycle in some entries, created rhythms and routines, reasons to check in on specific days, to encounter special trainers, or access special features. This precursor to modern daily login systems worked because it felt organic to the world rather than transparently designed to create habit formation, though the underlying psychology was similar. The decision to make time manipulation accessible through system clock changes gave players control while also creating minor exploits that some players used to bypass time gates, demonstrating the ongoing tension between developer intentions and player autonomy. The seasonal systems in certain regions pushed temporal variation even further, changing the available creatures, accessible areas, and visual appearance of routes based on the current month. This encouraged multiple playthroughs across real-world time, or at minimum motivated players to revisit areas they had already explored to see how they had changed. The seasonal variations added replayability and discovery moments, while also potentially frustrating players who wanted to catch specific creatures but had to wait months for the right season to arrive. The trade-off between creating dynamic worlds and respecting player time remains a recurring design challenge that different entries resolve in different ways. The contests and performance systems in various regions provided alternatives to battling as primary gameplay, allowing players to engage with their creatures in different contexts that emphasized different attributes. The beauty and talent aspects of creatures, usually irrelevant to combat effectiveness, became central to these alternative progression systems, creating value in creatures that might not excel in traditional battles. These systems never achieved the same centrality as battling, but provided welcome variety for players who enjoyed the creature collecting and customization aspects more than competitive combat. The effort put into creating robust systems for these alternative game modes demonstrated commitment to serving multiple playstyles within the same framework. The underground exploration systems, secret bases, and customizable spaces gave players ownership over small corners of the game world, places that could be personalized and shared with friends. These features created social gameplay beyond direct competition, spaces for creativity and expression that made the worlds feel more like places players inhabited rather than just moved through. The ability to visit friends' customized spaces and leave messages or items fostered a sense of community and persistent presence that transcended individual play sessions. The removal of these features in later entries was mourned by players who had valued the personal touch they brought to the experience. Slowly, the story widens as we recognize how interconnected all these systems and features are, how they build on and reference each other to create experiences that are greater than the sum of their parts. The franchise's willingness to experiment with different mechanics and features while maintaining core identity has kept it vital across decades, where most series either stagnate or lose their essence through radical reinvention. The balance between tradition and innovation, between honoring what works and trying new approaches, has generally served the series well, though individual changes always create divisions between those who appreciate evolution and those who prefer preservation. The fan base itself has become part of the franchise's identity, a global community spanning generations and cultures united by shared love for these games and creatures. The fan creations, from artwork to music, to stories to games, demonstrate how deeply the series has captured imaginations and inspired creativity. The willingness of developers to acknowledge and occasionally incorporate fan ideas shows recognition that the community has become steward of the franchise's culture alongside the official creators. The relationship between fan community and official content has been generally positive, with crossover in both directions, enriching both sides. The competitive scene, the casual players, the artists, the theorists, the speedrunners, the collectors, the shiny hunters, all these different sub-communities coexist within the larger fan base, sometimes overlapping and sometimes entirely separate, but all ultimately engaged with the same basic systems and creatures. This diversity of engagement styles demonstrates remarkable design flexibility, systems that can support radically different approaches and still provide satisfying experiences. The fact that someone can play casually without engaging with complex mechanics and still have a complete experience, while someone else can dive deep into optimization and find endless depth, shows careful thought about accessibility and skill floor versus skill ceiling. The nostalgia factor cannot be ignored when discussing the franchise's enduring appeal, as many current players were introduced through games they played as children and maintain affection for those early entries, regardless of objective quality comparisons. This nostalgia is simultaneously a strength that provides built-in audience for new entries and a challenge that creates impossible to satisfy expectations that each new game be exactly like the remembered favorites while also being completely fresh and innovative. The franchise must constantly negotiate between serving longtime fans who want familiarity and new players who need accessibility and novelty, a balancing act that grows more difficult as the gap between oldest and newest entries stretches across decades. The remakes and reimaginings of classic entries attempt to bridge this gap by updating beloved games with modern features and sensibilities while preserving what made them special, though opinions vary on whether any particular remake successfully threads this needle. The debates around which features to preserve from originals versus which to update from current design philosophy reflect deeper questions about what makes a game good and whether older design choices should be considered inherent to a game's identity or simply limitations of their time. These questions have no universally accepted answers, making each remake a lightning rod for discussion about preservation versus progress. The mobile games and spin-offs extend the franchise into different genres and platforms, reaching audiences who might never play a traditional entry, while also providing alternative ways for existing fans to engage with the universe. The success of the mobile augmented reality game demonstrated appetite for experiencing the franchise in radically different formats, bringing creature collection into the real world through phone screens and creating social phenomena around public gathering to catch rare spawns. The integration of real-world exercise and exploration into gameplay represented genuine innovation in how the franchise's core concepts could be translated to new contexts. The various spin-off series, from Mystery Dungeon to photography to fighting games, show the adaptability of the core concepts to wildly different gameplay styles and genres. Each spin-off series attracts its own dedicated fan base, while also introducing main series concepts to players who might not enjoy traditional role-playing games. The cross-pollination between main series and spin-offs has occasionally brought features and creatures from experimental side projects into the main timeline, demonstrating that innovation can come from unexpected places when developers are willing to experiment outside the standard formula. The merchandise empire surrounding the franchise creates touchpoints for engagement beyond games, from plushes to clothing to home goods to food products, making the creatures part of daily life in ways that purely digital entities usually cannot achieve. The trading card game remains its own massive phenomenon, with competitive scene and collector culture completely independent from the video games, despite sharing characters and concepts. The anime continues to introduce new generations to the franchise while providing ongoing narrative content for existing fans, creating a multimedia experience where game, card, and show all reinforce each other while serving different purposes. As we drift toward the end of our gentle journey through these facts tonight, consider how remarkable it is that a franchise born on the limited hardware of the original Game Boy has grown into a multimedia empire while maintaining its essential character. The core appeals of exploration, collection, customization, and companionship remain central even as presentation and complexity have evolved dramatically. The emotional bonds players form with their teams, the satisfaction of completing a difficult challenge, the joy of discovering something new. These fundamental pleasures have persisted across technological generations and demographic shifts. The franchise's ability to inspire genuine emotion, to create memories that last decades, to bring people together across cultural and linguistic barriers, speaks to something deeper than mere marketing success or addictive game design. There is authentic creativity and care embedded in these games, a genuine desire to create experiences that will mean something to players, that will teach lessons about friendship and perseverance and respect for nature, while also simply being fun to play. The balancing of commercial considerations with artistic vision, of broad accessibility with meaningful depth, of tradition with innovation, these ongoing negotiations define the franchise as much as any specific feature or creature. The future of the franchise remains uncertain in specifics while being clearly secure in general terms, as new entries will continue to be produced as long as they remain profitable, which current trajectory suggests will be for many years to come. The questions of what new mechanics will be introduced, what regions will be explored, what creatures will be added, what features from past games will be revived or abandoned, these mysteries keep longtime fans engaged in speculating between releases. The hope that the next entry will recapture the magic of a personal favorite while also pushing the series forward drives discussion and anticipation in the years between major releases. The accessibility improvements and quality of life features that have accumulated across generations make modern entries significantly more respectful of player time and more welcoming to new audiences. Though some veterans miss the friction and inconveniences that made older games feel more challenging or immersive, the ongoing conversation about difficulty settings and optional challenge modes reflects desires for games that can serve both casual players wanting relaxing experiences and hardcore fans wanting to be tested, though implementing this in ways that satisfy both audiences remains elusive. The success of self-imposed challenge runs like Nuzlocke demonstrates that players will create their own difficulty when games do not provide it, suggesting that perhaps the franchise's traditional accessibility-first approach is appropriate. The artistic evolution from pixel sprites to full 3D models represents a double-edged sword, gaining visual expressiveness while losing some of the iconic simplicity that made early designs so memorable and easily reproducible by fans. The debate over whether newer creature designs are inherently worse than classic ones, or whether nostalgia bias affects judgment, will likely never be resolved, as aesthetic preferences are ultimately subjective, and in every generation contains both strong and weak designs. The important thing is that new designs continue to resonate with new generations of players, creating the same sense of discovery and attachment that classic designs created for earlier audiences. The soundtrack evolution from chiptune constraints to fully orchestrated pieces demonstrates similar trade offs, gaining production value while losing some of the raw earworm quality that made simple Game Boy melodies so memorable. The best modern tracks maintain melodic strength while taking advantage of improved audio capabilities, proving that technological advancement and musical memorability are not mutually exclusive. The continued popularity of fan arrangements and the frequency with which official concerts feature even the earliest compositions suggests that the musical legacy is secure regardless of format. The teaching potential of the franchise, from basic math through type matchups and stat calculations to more advanced probability and resource management, has been recognized by educators who use the games as engagement tools for resistant learners. The strategy and critical thinking required for success, especially at competitive levels, exercises skills that transfer to other domains while being packaged as entertainment rather than education. The social skills developed through trading, battling, and discussing the games with peers provide valuable experience in negotiation, good sportsmanship, and collaborative problem solving. These educational benefits are secondary to entertainment, but nonetheless real and valuable. The cultural impact of the franchise on the generation that grew up with it cannot be overstated, influencing not just gaming preferences, but broader cultural literacy and social bonds. The shared vocabulary of type matchups and creature names, the common reference points of iconic moments from games or show, the nostalgia for simpler times when these games represented cutting-edge entertainment, all these elements create touchstones for connection and conversation. The franchise has become part of the cultural fabric in ways that transcend mere commercial success, achieving genuine iconic status that ensures its place in gaming history, regardless of future developments. The speedrunning community has discovered that even the most tightly designed games contain sequence breaks and exploits that allow for dramatically different experiences than developers intended, turning casual adventures into technical showcases of precise input timing and route optimization. The discovery and documentation of glitches and tricks demonstrates the depth of engagement possible when players approach familiar games from entirely new angles. The friendly competition within speedrunning communities and the celebration of new record achievements shows how single-player games can still foster social engagement and shared goals. The randomizer community has similarly found ways to breathe new life into old games by shuffling locations of items and creatures, creating endless novelty from static content through procedural rearrangement. The problem solving required. When familiar strategies no longer work due to changed availability, creates fresh challenges that test deep understanding of mechanics rather than simple memorization. The streaming of randomized runs creates entertainment both for players navigating unknown challenges and viewers experiencing familiar games from new perspectives. The ROM hacking community has created entirely new games using the original engines as foundations, from simple difficulty adjustments to complete overhauls with new regions, stories, and creatures. The most ambitious fan projects rival official releases in scope and polish, demonstrating the passion and talent within the community while also raising interesting questions about intellectual property and transformative works. The generally permissive attitude toward fan games and ROM hacks, with rare exceptions, suggests understanding that these projects generate enthusiasm and keep older games relevant rather than competing with official releases. As we approach the end of our time together tonight, reflecting on all these layers of complexity and history and community that have accumulated around what began as simple Game Boy games, we might feel overwhelmed by how much there is to know and experience. But that overwhelming scope is also beautiful, a testament to how something that resonated with people could grow and evolve and inspire without losing the essential spark that made it special in the first place. The franchise welcomes both casual engagement and deep obsession, both brief nostalgia trips and lifelong dedication, both solitary play and social connection. The creatures themselves, numbering now in the hundreds, each represent countless hours of design work and iteration, efforts to create beings that are memorable, functional, and meaningful. The fact that nearly all of them have fans, that virtually every creature is someone's favorite, shows successful diversity of designs and appeals. The tier lists and usage statistics from competitive play tell only part of the story, as utility and power are just some of many reasons to value a creature. The personal connections, the aesthetics, the nostalgia, the move pool synergy with favorite strategies, all these factors contribute to which creatures resonate with which players. The items scattered throughout the games, from healing consumables to rare evolution stones to battle-changing held items, each serve purposes both mechanical and narrative, facilitating gameplay while also implying the existence of economies and technologies within the world. The careful balancing of item availability and pricing creates resource management considerations without ever becoming punishing or frustrating for players who simply want to progress through stories. The rare items that require significant effort or luck to obtain create long-term goals and achievement moments that extend engagement beyond primary narratives. The moves themselves, numbering in the hundreds across all types and effects, create the strategic vocabulary that defines battles and team building. The distribution of which creatures can learn which moves follows patterns both logical and arbitrary, creating distinctive identities through move pool limitations and advantages. The process of deciding which 4 moves each creature should know creates agonizing choices between coverage, utility, and specialization, ensuring that team building remains engaging puzzle rather than obvious optimization. The continued addition of new moves while others fall into obscurity or are removed shows ongoing curation of mechanical complexity to maintain depth without becoming overwhelming. The abilities that define how creatures function in battle add another dimension to identity and strategy, passive effects that trigger automatically in response to conditions or simply modify how the creature operates. The clever abilities that completely change how certain creatures are played demonstrate the design space that passive effects enable, turning potential weaknesses into strengths or creating unique niches that otherwise identical stat distributions could not. The hidden abilities that provide alternatives to standard options add another layer of collection goals and optimization considerations for players who want to maximize potential. The held items that creatures can carry into battle enable strategies and counters that would be impossible through moves and abilities alone, the single item slot forcing meaningful choices about what role each creature should fill. The berries that activate automatically under specific conditions create timing puzzles and prediction games as players try to trigger or prevent their effects. The choice items that lock creatures into single moves while boosting power create risk-reward dynamics that make battles more dynamic and less predictable. The status conditions and weather effects and terrain modifications and stat changes, all these additional systems layer onto base mechanics to create emergent complexity where interactions between multiple systems produce outcomes that would be impossible from any single element. The depth that emerges from relatively simple foundational rules demonstrates elegant design where a few core concepts combine to generate endless variation and strategic possibility. The accessibility of basics combined with the depth of mastery, creates a skill progression that serves players across a wide spectrum of engagement levels and abilities. The relationship between the games and the trading card game continues to fascinate as we explore how these different mediums influence each other in unexpected ways. When certain creature designs or mechanics prove popular in one format, they often migrate to the other, creating a constant dialogue between physical cards and digital worlds that enriches both experiences. The card game's more visible and collectible nature means that designs sometimes debut there before appearing in main series games, testing player reactions and market viability before committing resources to full 3D models and battle animations. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.